Welcome wherever you are in the world watching this year. Today's topic is the Melave Malka. The Melave Malka, which literally means to accompany the king or the queen, is a reference to the Shabbos, and it's a special meal that we have at the end of Shabbos, whereby we accompany, as it were, the Shabbos queen or king as she leaves. Let's look at text number one. Text number one is a quote from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, who wrote a unique code of Jewish law, and this is based on earlier codes. He writes as follows, chapter 300 of Orach Chaim, which deals with the daily conduct of a Jew. He writes, "It's a good practice to cook meat or other dishes on Moishe Shabbos." Let's start again. We're no good. Let's start again.
Let me start again. Hold on, because I still had the thing on the overlay. I have to start right with it off. Okay. You want to make like a siman? How I know when to put it on?
I'll announce it.
You say when you say.
Let's look at text number one.
And then we'll put it on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on again.
Welcome to this class, the topic of which is the meal that we eat at the conclusion of the Shabbat, known as the Melave Malka, which means to accompany the queen, accompany the king, a reference to the Shabbat, as Shabbat leaves. We're going to explore the reason for this meal, and as always, the profound spiritual message it carries for each and every one of us. Let's begin our journey. The first text we're going to look at is from the Code of Jewish Law. We're quoting specifically from the Alter Rebbe, that's the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Zalman, his code, which itself is a quote from earlier sources in reference to this particular meal. Let's look at it now. So this is from chapter 300 of Orach Chaim, which is a section of the Code of Jewish Law that deals with a Jew's daily conduct. There it says, "It is a good practice to cook meat or other dishes on Moishe Shabbos, on Saturday night, in honor of this meal." In brackets, he writes, "One need not eat the third Shabbos meal earlier in the day in order to be able to eat a full meal then, since this meal is not so obligatory. Rather, it is a choice, enhanced mitzvah." In Hebrew, mitzvah min hamuvchar, end of quote. So what does he say? He's saying, ideally one should eat a full meal at this after post-Shabbos meal. However, one doesn't have to plan for it, in as much that the third meal, on Shabbos we eat Friday night a meal, Shabbos day, and then a third meal towards the end of the day. So the author is saying that third meal, you don't have to plan to eat it earlier so that after Shabbat you have an appetite for a full meal. And the reason you don't have to do that is because this meal is only an enhanced mitzvah. Hence, you don't have to ensure that you have an appetite to eat it with meat or other dishes, as stated at the very beginning of this law. Now, our question is quite simply this: why not? If it's a mitzvah min hamuvchar, which means the choice and best way to fulfill a mitzvah, well, wouldn't we be encouraged to fulfill any commandment in the most choice and preferred way? So why would the law not tell us, encourage us? The second afternoon meal or the third meal on Shabbat, the second for Shabbat day, and make sure to eat that early enough so that when Shabbos is over, you have appetite for a full meal. So it's kind of strange. We're calling it a choice mitzvah on the one hand. On the other hand, well, don't worry about it. It's not so obligatory, and You don't have to prepare yourself. Even, actually, he states, to eat fruit would be sufficient. Just the merest snack. Why? Why not be prepared and eat a full meal? So to answer this question, friends, we need to understand what is the source altogether of this meal. To understand that, let's go back to what's the source of eating 3 meals on Shabbat altogether. We just made reference to the third Shabbat afternoon meal called Shalashudas. What's the source of that? So quote number 2. The Talmud in Tractate Shabbos points to Exodus, Shemos, chapter 16, verse 25. And Moishe said, eat it today, for today is Shabbos unto God. Today you will not find any in the field. End of quote. The story there is, this week's Parshat, a double portion of manna fell on Friday, that first Friday when the manna began to fall, that first week. Nothing fell the next day. The people were somewhat perplexed. They went out to seek it. They couldn't find any. So Moishe tells them, eat today what you got yesterday, because today is Shabbos. Today you won't find any in the field. Now note, and this was bolded when you looked at the text, the word today appears 3 times. The verse could have easily had said, eat it today because it's Shabbos, you won't find any in the field, with a reference to the word today once. Yet the verse mentions that word hayom, today, 3 times. Aha! Here the Torah is hinting that on Shabbos one should eat 3 meals. Friday night, Shabbos lunch or Shabbos morning, and then the third meal, Shabbos afternoon. That's the origin of the 3 meals on Shabbat. Our question is, what about the meal? What's the origin of the meal on Saturday night, Mitzvah Shabbat? Let's look at quote number 3, text number 3. This is from the Talmud, Tractate Shabbos, page 117b, where the Talmud says, one should set one's table on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, even though he will eat only a minimum amount. Reason, Rashi, commentary right there on the Talmud says, this too is in honor of Shabbos. For thus we accompany the Shabbos as she departs in an honorable manner. In like manner that a person accompanies the king as he leaves the city. End quote. So Rashi is explaining what the Talmud is saying. By having a set table and not the leftover of the last third meal of Shabbat, it's set, it's arranged. This is in honor of Shabbat. How so? It is similar to accompanying the king or the queen, the metaphor for Shabbat, as the king leaves the city. So this is the classic origin for this effectively 4th meal, this meal that we have on Motzei Shabbat. 2 questions. Number 1, we can understand why you would have a set table, because when Shabbat leaves, the house is honorable, presentable, so the table is set. But why would that necessitate eating? Why is eating, even a small amount, even fruit, as we mentioned earlier, why is that integral to accompanying the Shabbat as Shabbat leaves? Second question, a simpler, much more powerful question. But friends, as soon as you make Havdalah, or even if we don't, mind you, as soon as the 3 stars appear, the holiness of Shabbos is gone. Well, particularly if one has made the Havdalah service. This is after the Havdalah service. This is after we've said the evening service, either at home or in shul. The question is, Shabbos is gone. The king has departed. What is meant by accompanying the king? To make that very clear, on Shabbat we may do no manner of work. When Shabbos is over, all manners of work are permissible. The sanctity is no longer. It's no longer the holy day of rest. So in what sense are we kind of accompanying, implying that Shabbat is still somehow here, but leaving? What is this quasi-state? So we're going to answer now this last question I just asked. There is in fact a quasi-state. Notwithstanding the fact that Shabbat is over, it somehow lingers. In what sense? Let's look at quote number 4. The Talmud tractate Beitza says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, the Holy One, blessed be He, grants a person an additional soul on Erev Shabbat. That's on Friday as Shabbos begins. And on Motzei Shabbat, He takes it back. How does this answer our question? Let's look at quote number 5 from the Shari Tshuva, which is a commentary on the Code of Jewish Law, on this very chapter 300, which is what we're looking at. There, the author writes, the disciples of the Arizal, the famed Kabbalist, revealed that the additional soul does not fully depart until after the Motzei Shabbat meal. Accordingly, one ought not, this is not forbidden, but it's kind of encouraged, engaged in work other than food preparation until after this meal. Mystery is beginning to unravel. In what sense is the Shabbat still here? The additional soul that we are granted, every Jew is granted on Shabbat, doesn't depart the person till after the Shabbat meal. Now that, by the way, is the reason why we smell spices, inhale spices at the Havdalah, the inverse of the Kiddush, where we declare the sanctity in the fact that Shabbat is leaving. We inhale these spices because we are spiritually faint. This additional soul has departed, and so by smelling the spices, we're trying to summon forth the soul that we have, ever present, on a deeper level to fill that vacuum that's been created by the additional soul that we were granted that is now being taken from us. The same way when a person faints. Smelling salts, spices, it touches the soul very deeply. Aroma is a very, very deep, evocative experience. Smells bring us back much more to the past than even a vision or description of it, or even seeing a picture of it. That's because aroma is breath, and the soul is the breath of life. So the soul has left this additional sacred soul. We inhale the spices to encourage or to summon forth the soul that we have to express itself in an ever deeper way, filling that gap. But the disciples of the Arizal added that the soul doesn't leave, it still lingers till after this meal. Now that's answered our question that we just asked. In what sense is Shabbat still here? The sanctity is clearly over. It's now weekday. It lingers. The Shabbat soul is still present until after this Melave Malka, after this meal, which now begs the next question. What's the connection to the meal? Why is it that the meal, it's only after the Melave Malka, that Saturday night meal, that the soul leaves? Why does it linger till then, and how is it connected to the meal? Let's summarize the questions we need to understand right now. In summary, we want to understand on a deeper level the significance of this meal, Melave Malka, the Saturday night meal, and why the extra soul we endowed is somehow linked to it, remains still within us until this meal is over. And additionally, this will also explain, we kind of have already, in what sense are we accompanying the Shabbat as she leaves? In what sense is Shabbat still here? We've answered that really now. That's the extra soul we're endowed. That's the Shabbos queen, the Shabbos king, the soul that He granted each one of us. But what needs to be explained is, why does it stay on? And why is it linked to this meal? Not just a beautifully set table, but a meal. Perhaps just a simple one, a meal of fruit. Doesn't have to be elaborate, but a meal nonetheless is integral to somehow the extra soul and the spirit of Shabbat, the king still remaining, gone in essence, but still present in as much that this special Shabbat soul, the Neshama Yisera, is still with us. In other words, we really don't understand exactly what is happening with Shabbat. What is this extra soul? What's this meal all about? Now we'll begin really to unravel, decode the meaning of this profound Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, Melave Malka. Friends, let's look at text number 6. And Moshe said, God will give bread, manna, in the morning. Which means quite simply that when did the manna fall? In the morning. Quote number 7, how much manna fell? An omer. Torah says it was an omer. An omer is a measure of dry goods. In this case, the measure of manna. And this omer, which is the 10th of an ephah, this omer, it's about 1.25 quarts, friends, physically. That would be the volume. Provided for 2 breads or 2 meals. So every day, friends, in the course of the 40 years in the desert, except for Shabbat and Yom Tov, a measure, an omer for each individual fell, and it provided minimally for 2 meals. Meaning that meal during the day and a meal at night. So what do we see now? This is something quite extraordinary. That meant that on Friday, when 2 measures fell, so let's walk it through. What did they provide each individual Jew with? The first measure for Friday morning and Friday night. The second measure for Shabbat morning and after Shabbat. So in the same way that they ate a meal at night throughout the 40 years in the desert, now they're eating the Saturday night meal from manna that fell on Shabbat. On Friday, in honor of Shabbat. So the second portion, let's be clear, the Friday night Shabbat meal is not unique to the manna of Shabbat, because that fell with the Friday allotted portion, which is enough for the morning and something during the day and for at night too. It's the second portion that fell exclusively for Shabbat that provided also for a meal after Shabbat. So now the Rebbe reveals a very novel reason for eating a Melave Malka, this Saturday night meal. It's not simply, we'll tie it all in together, not simply accompanying Shabbat as she leaves, but there's a dimension to this. It's connected to the manna. And we'll soon explain how they're really one thing. But so far, let's clearly identify that eating the meal on Saturday night is also recalling the manna that fell in the desert. The extra portion that fell on Shabbat. Because there was enough, that extra portion provided for the day and the night. So in the same way then, that we eat 3 meals on Shabbat to recall the manna, the 4th meal is an extension of that and recalls the manna. Now let's revisit quote number 1 and clarify quote number 1 and answer the question that we had asked earlier, the outset. We go back to quote number 1. The square brackets told us you don't have to eat the 3rd Shabbos afternoon meal earlier in order to be able to eat an elaborate meal on Saturday night, because it's only an enhanced mitzvah. And we said, if it's an enhanced mitzvah, then one that encourages to observe it in an enhanced and beautiful way. We'd assumed we learned that. Sorry?
Finished with
Yeah. We'd assumed we learned that the enhanced mitzvah is nothing to do with the Shabbos meals. It's a separate meal, and as we learned the quotes, connected with accompanying the Shabbat as she leaves. We have now discovered, no, this is a continuation of the meals we ate on Shabbat. It's an acknowledgement that the manna that fell on Friday in honor of Shabbat also sustained them Saturday night. And now we understand the enhanced mitzvah. Which mitzvah? To remember the manna. And now we appreciate too that it's enough to remember it even with the smallest meal. Because to actually eat a full meal, that was quote number 2 we had. The 3 references to today. Eat a proper meal. This is the carryover. This meal that we eat after Shabbat is the carryover, the fact that the manna that fell on Friday also provided for Saturday night, because it's enough to observe the mitzvah in an enhanced way, which is remember everything the manna provided, including a meal Saturday night. So therefore, no need for elaborate meal, but some kind of meal to recall the fact that the manna, in fact, be something that they ate, not as an obligation, but that they did eat on Saturday night. The obligation is to eat the 3 meals in Shabbat, today. But the reality, the fact is that the manna fell and provided for day and night, so they would always be eating Saturday night of the manna that fell on Friday, the second portion. So to fully remember the manna, in addition to the 3 meals and their bona fide meals, at least something Saturday night. So that answers why it's not necessary to eat a full meal like the 3 meals of Shabbat, because they are actual obligations. Today, in reference to the manna, eat a proper meal. What we are doing in eating our meal Saturday night, Matzai Shabbat, the Melave Malka, is recalling in an enhanced way, what did the manna provide? It also provided for Saturday night. Now, what's the connection to accompanying the king? So now we've arrived at this meal on Matzai Shabbat. It's not so much about accompanying Shabbat as she leaves. It's more about remembering the provision of the manna, which also provided for Saturday night. But as we learned from the Talmud, and Rashi explained, that this meal is honor to Shabbat as she leaves. And that we need to understand. So we learned so far that on one hand, Shabbos is over Saturday night, but it still lingers in form of the extra soul that we are endowed. And now we're learning, and that's somehow linked to this meal, which we explained is in honor of the manna. So to tie this all together. Before we do that, let's look at text number 8. This is from the Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah. We're told in Bereshit, Vayevorech, and God blessed the 7th day, Vayikadesh Oto, and He sanctified it. Say our sages, what's blessed and what is sanctified? What are they referring to? He blessed it, Borchoi, or Birchoi, with manna, inasmuch that on Erev Shabbos, on Friday, 2 measures fell. He sanctified it, Kitshoi, with manna, inasmuch that on Shabbos, none fell at all. Now, just understanding this superficially, it's just the same thing positively and negatively. You're saying that He blessed it, a double portion of manna fell on Friday. He sanctified it, none fell on Shabbat. What's the difference there? In light of what we said now, there is a difference. The sanctification of the 7th day starts with candle lighting and ends when Shabbat is over. And for that 24 hours, no manna falls. But the blessing of Shabbat begins on Erev Shabbat and, in fact, lingers into after Shabbat. So it stretches beyond the sanctity. It starts earlier. The blessing starts earlier because the Shabbat portion falls on Friday, And moreover, as we pointed out, it provided for a meal after Shabbat. So whereas the sanctity is exclusively those 24 hours of Shabbat, the blessing starts before and continues even later. So now we're going to explain in a beautifully, very deep way the significance of this meal, why accompanying the Shabbos is associated with this Melave Malka and eating food and the manna. How does it all tie in? So friends, bear with me. It is very beautiful. Let's look at quote number 9, text number 9. This is from the Beis Yosef. This is Rabbi Yosef Cairo. In his commentary to the original Code of Jewish Law, again the same chapter, chapter 300, he writes, there is one limb in the body called the loose bone that does not derive nourishment from any food other than the meal of Motzei Shabbos. So right there, wow, this is an incredible reason to eat this meal, however much we eat of it, because it nourishes a bone, which is, there's several opinions. According to majority opinion, it's the bone just below the skull, the connecting bone between the skull and the spine. Next quote, friends, from Rabbi. Accordingly, the loose bone did not derive nourishment from the forbidden tree of knowledge and is therefore invincible. Let me explain. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They did. By eating of it, they corrupted their entire body, inviting, therefore, first and foremost, death. The body would have been eternal and was corrupted because of the forbidden fruit they ate, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We just learned that this bone does not derive any nourishment from any food other than the meal Saturday night. So this bone remains impervious, was not corrupted by the consumption of the forbidden fruit. Our question now is, so why does it need to be nourished by any food at all? And why is it the food of Saturday night, only this meal, the Melave Malka, that nourishes this tiny bone? And if anything, you would expect the Shabbat meal, the sacred meals of Shabbat, to nourish this loose bone. Before I go further, I will share with the listeners, Rabbi Nissen Mangel, may God bless him with long life, a survivor of Auschwitz. He was a child in Auschwitz. He related this to us many years ago as a guest speaker, that he worked in the crematorium and his job was to clear the ashes. And he saw this tiny, tiny little pebble-like bone that the crematoria could not disintegrate, could not burn. Incredibly, working there strengthened his faith in the eternity of the Jewish people, because it's from this bone God promises that the physical body is resurrected and built up again, and the soul drawn into it. This, friends, is the greatest article of our faith, the culminating expression of our faith, the culminating promise of God. It's not merely the Messianic era, but that all that lived and contributed to the Messianic era, as every soul does indispensably. Every soul comes back into the body, the soul occupied, and the body rebuilt and perfected. And here in this world, in essence, it remains in this tiny loose bone. Our question is, why does it require nourishment from any meal? And if we had to choose one, we would have thought it would be Shabbat. Shabbat is in fact the foretaste of the Messianic era. So why would these holy meals not be the meal to nourish this etzem loose bone? Let's look at the next quote. Quote number 11. From the Shach and his commentary to Parshas Kedoshim, had Adam waited the 3 hours till Shabbos and then eaten from the tree of knowledge, death would not exist. This tree of knowledge, they were created, Adam and Eve, on Friday in the afternoon. And they were told not to eat of this yet. But had they waited, and then they would have been commanded to eat of the tree of knowledge on Shabbat, that would have been indeed their Shabbat meal. Had they done so, that would have been the Messianic era then and there, and there would be no death. Not meant to be by divine design, because it would have been a very shallow Messianic era, not having worked or toiled or invested or partnered with God for it to happen. Still, ever since, we are rectifying that and bringing about an ultimately and therefore very deep Messianic era as a result of our great toil and sacrifice and devotion to God over the millennia. So here's the thing, friends. Next quote. Quote text number 7 from the Midrash from Mechilta. Shabbos is a foretaste of the world to come. That's true. But when Shabbos is over, that experience is over. That experience, that connection to the perfect Messianic era, we're worry-free on Shabbat, that's true. But once Shabbat is over, the reality of life and its struggles, trials and tribulations beset us. Herein lies, therefore, the unique role of the Melave Malka, and why this loose bone is nourished from this meal. What is this meal? What did we learn today? What did we discover? This meal is because the manna in honor of Shabbos continue to sustain them after Shabbat. The holiness is gone, but we are drawing, the blessing continues. We are drawing and bringing the holiness of Shabbat, which is a foretaste of the Messianic era, where? To this dark world, so that ultimately we will transform it and make the whole world forever Shabbat. That's that meal. This bone is nourished not by the meal of Shabbat, because that's detached from the world. It's nourished by the lingering manna, by the bracha of Shabbat, that continues into Saturday night when the holiness is over, with the extra soul that is being endowed to us. This extra soul gives us the power and ability, by drawing on it, to illuminate the world. So let's be clear. We've got to eat something. It's got to be food. We want to bring this holiness down into the physical world. We want to set in motion the day when death is swallowed up forever and the body is eternal, the physical body. So this bone that's indestructible is nourished from the blessing of Shabbat, the manna that continues after Shabbat. And it's so powerful because what it's doing is it's linking the holiness of Shabbat and the weekday, profane, mundane world with the objective of fusing the two. And one day, mitzvah after mitzvah, the world becomes Shabbat. When, in the final quote, from Yeshaya, death will be swallowed up forever, and God the Lord will wipe away the tears from upon every face. So in summary, then, in conclusion, this meal, Matzah Shabbat, what is it? We eat it because, although it's not a holy time anymore, but the empowerment of Shabbat continues. The blessing of Shabbat continues. In the desert already, the manna that fell in honor of Shabbat continued to nourish them even Saturday night. That's so symbolic. It's saying that our mission is to bring Shabbat, that it spill over into the world. I use that metaphor because that's why we make the wine spill over from the cup of Avdol into the plate below. Our mission is to bring Shabbat down and make the whole world Shabbat. So it's a meal, and that tiny indestructible bone is nourished by it, empowering it. It's the process by which the body and every human body will become eternal, life eternal here on earth. So that meal, in other words, represents and empowers us to illuminate this cold, dark, difficult world with the sanctity of Shabbat. The sanctity is over, but the Jew has the power to make it continue. That additional soul that God gave us continues to linger even after the sanctity is over. That's the power of the Jew. That's the power of the blessing that Shabbat conveys. The word blessing in Hebrew, bracha, means to draw down. We have the ability to bring, even though Shabbos is left, we can bring her down and fuse Shabbat with the world forever, which will manifest in the eternity of the body, going back to Eden, but this time in the richest, deepest way. Death swallowed up forever, soul and body fused as one eternally, heaven on earth. Hope you were successful in explaining the subject. Okay.
I stopped recording.
Huh?
Stop, I finished the recording.
Okay. Sorry.
I hope it worked out because it's such a racket.
I know. Okay. Too bad.
The ball was disturbing you?
What?
It was disturbing
A little
you?
bit.
It was bothering me because I'm like, it's going to ruin the